The current wage gap in the UK stands at around 17.9%. But what does that actually mean? For this video, I will be using the Office for National Statistics (ONS) definition, which is the difference between average hourly earnings, excluding overtime, of men and women. However, the public tend to believe it as being more simple than that, and indeed some people would go as far as to believe that it is the amount of money that all women get paid less than all men. This is simply not the case, even as the ONS point out themselves. It is not a measure of difference between men and women for doing the same job. As in, the wage gap is about averages within certain groups. For example, the difference between men working full-time and women working full-time, men working in sales compared to women working in sales. So it is important to note here that the ONS do not include overtime when calculating the gap. As the ONS say, men work more overtime than women. And this would skew the gap. So it's not correct to dismiss the gap as simply being a product of men working more overtime than women, because while it is true that they do, on average, that fact is not calculated into the numbers as overtime hours are not actively included. So what are the numbers? Well, according to the ONS, the total gap between men and women is 17.9% as of 2019. This means that, on average, women earn 17.9% less than men. Again, it needs to be stated here that it does not mean that a woman is earning less than a man for doing the same job. And herein lies a core problem with reporting on wage gaps. It often makes headlines for its easy to sensationalize figures, but the calculations and nuances often become lost in technicalities. Let's break the numbers down a little further. The gap between men and women in full-time work is 8.9% in favour of men, while the gap between men and women in part-time work is 4.4% in favour of women. Note, it's interesting that the ONS report on part-time gaps as a negative 4.4%. implying that there is less than a gap, which actually what they mean is men in part-time work actually earn 4.4% less than women. Another thing to note is that there is a particular gap often not talked about in the same way as the gap for full-time workers. So if the gap for full-time is 8.9% in favour of men, and the gap for part-time is 4.4% in favour of women, how does this come out to a total of 17.9% overall? That's a good question. According to the ONS, when calculating averages and percentages in multiple groups and then combining them for a total average, you come across this problem often. It's called Simpson's paradox. We'd expect the total combined number to be something like 2%, but actually it increases to 17.9%. This is because when combining the totals of all men and all women working in full-time and part-time, you are raising the average difference between the lowest and the highest pay. Is this a legitimate and genuine method of calculating a wage gap, though? This seems dishonest as it doesn't factor in many variables and, as alluded to earlier on, leads people to believe that women earn even less than men even for doing the same job. You cannot compare a part-time retail store worker to a full-time banker and then claim there is a legitimate gap that is cause for concern and must be addressed with affirmative action or government schemes. Returning to the makeup of the numbers, in order to fully understand the gap, we have to have details about statistics. For example, women work the majority of part-time jobs, and a majority of women work part-time instead of full-time. Typically, part-time work pays less than full-time. However, according to the ONS, women were also taking more of the new full-time jobs than men, proportionally. While on the face of it, this may seem encouraging in terms of narrowing the gap, it is also worth pointing out, as the ONS also does, that pay for new work is often likely to be lower, so may actually reduce women's average pay overall. Also, the job fields which saw the biggest increase in the proportion of full-time women were jobs that, on average, have lower pay. Sales, customer service, elementary occupation and process, and plant and machine operatives. It's interesting to note here that the ONS report states the largest and the lowest gaps over all job fields. Whilst this is interesting from an analytical perspective, it is also interesting from a linguistic point of view. It is noted that the largest gap occurs in joiners and carpenters, where women earn 44% less than men. And the lowest gap is with archivists and curators with a negative 36% gap. What does this mean? Well, it would appear to suggest that gaps in which men earn more than women are simply called large wage gaps, with the implication that they are bad, whereas gaps in which women earn more than men, for example archivists and curators, where men earn 36% less than women, are called low wage gaps. A negative gap is an impossibility. It is still just a gap. If we are to believe that 44% is a large gap, then are we not also to believe that 36% in favour of women is also a large gap that should be addressed in some capacity? This is evidence that the words we use are important. Moving on to the breakdown by age, you can see here that the gap increases for women in age groups 22 to 29 onwards. From this point on, every age group sees an increase in the gap. Why might this be? Well, as also noted in this graph, the proportion of women working part-time increases for each age group without pause, while the proportion of young men working part-time consistently decreases for each consecutive age group. As we have already discussed, part-time work typically pays less, so why would women work more part-time jobs the older they get? Well, one possible explanation is that the average age for a first-time mother in the UK is around 28 to 29 years old, meaning that from the next age group, 30 to 39, many women are mothers and are looking after children. Some women do not return to full-time work after childbirth and prefer the flexibility that part-time work offers them. And while attitudes around parenting responsibilities are slowly changing, it is simply a matter of fact that women tend to be the ones responsible for the majority of childcare. Note that this is not a judgment in whether this is a good or a bad thing, just that it is simply the case. Another possible explanation is something called the commuting gap. That is, women are apparently more likely to quit their jobs because of a long commute to work. In other words, some women are actively choosing to quit their jobs and potentially have lower paid jobs that are closer to home because they don't want to commute. This could be for a variety of reasons, such as the aforementioned child-raising responsibility. Another thing to note is that men are actually more likely to tolerate longer journeys to work if it means higher pay. So, all of these circumstances come together to create a situation in which women on average earn less than men for reasons not entirely beyond their control. So what can be said about the gap? Firstly, it does not seem reasonable to bundle full-time average wages and part-time average wages and then proclaim a legitimate gap. Secondly, even without the subgroups of part-time or full-time, it does not seem reasonable to compare and/or average wages across different job fields. As in, it does not seem reasonable to include into the calculation the average wages of jobs with high average wages, such as lawyers, into those with lower average wages, such as retail staff. but this is what the ONS definition of the wage gap does. Finally, we are not explicitly told why narrowing the wage gap is necessary or good, at least not by the ONS report. As mentioned before, it seems to be implied to be a bad thing when referring to gaps that favour men, but this attitude is not often mirrored in regards to gaps favouring women. This could be seen as a double standard. In conclusion, there seems to be a multitude of reasons behind any particular group having some kind of wage gap. It would seem fanciful to imagine a group having a perfect balance between men and women without it being somehow forced into existence. Many reasons for the gaps are down to personal choices, and many other reasons are down to cultural attitudes, both to work preferences and to perceived gender roles. These will be topics for future videos in the Gender/Feminism series. If you have any thoughts on the topic, please let me know down in the comments.